Today's Friday Forum is made possible by Bank of the Cascades, CenturyLink, Family Care Health Plan, Miller Nash, The Standard, and Stoll Reeves.
Welcome to City Club of Portland Friday Forum. I'm John Horvick, City Club President, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike. Those of you who join us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. Today, Laural Porter will interview Representative Earl Blumenauer as he lays out his vision of why and how the government needs to change federal drug laws. But first, some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Bank of the Cascades, CenturyLink, Family Care Health Plans, Miller Nash, The Standard, and Stoll Reeves. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. Our Friday Forums in February will discuss the Olympics, police in Portland, and Chair Marissa Madrigal will give her State of the Multnomah County address. You can learn more about these and other City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, City Club will be live tweeting today's event. You can follow or mention us at pdxcityclub, and be sure to use the hashtag CityClub in your own tweets. We'll be having a Q&A session with our guests at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. For all our audience participants, please locate the index cards in the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. We'll collect them prior to the start of the Q&A. And now to our program. Representative Earl Blumenauer has been a lifelong resident of Oregon's 3rd Congressional District and has served the district in the United States House of Representatives since 1996. Early last year, he authored a report called The Path Forward, Rethinking Federal Marijuana Policy, which listed several steps the United States should take to align federal policies with the views of a growing majority of Americans. Representative Blumenauer currently serves on the Ways and Means Committee and the Budget Committee. I'm also proud to note that he has been a member of City Club since 1970. Thank you, Congressman, for your sustained commitment to citizen engagement. Laural Porter is an anchor and reporter at KGW TV. She is also host of KGW's current affairs show, Straight Talk. She joined the KGW team in 2000. Laurel is a 5-time Northwest Regional Emmy winner and winner of a National Edward R. Murrow Award for her feature reporting. She's also been nominated twice for an Emmy for her role as moderator of Straight Talk. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Representative Earl Blumenauer and Laural Porter to the stage. Have fun.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here with you today for today's City Club of Portland Friday Forum. It is my honor to serve as your moderator for this important and timely topic. Congressman Earl Blumenauer is a leader in Washington, D.C. on marijuana reform and has been for decades. He believes there is a revolution underway in the treatment of marijuana across the United States. 20 states, including Oregon and the District of Columbia, have already authorized the use of medical marijuana. And our neighbors in Washington and Colorado are the first to legalize it for recreational use. Oregonians voted down a legalization measure in 2012, but there is a good chance a new measure will appear on this November's ballot and possibly in at least 4 other states. Just 3 months ago, a Gallup poll showed 58% of those surveyed said marijuana should be legalized. That's a 10 percentage point jump in just 1 year. The Obama administration last year said it would not interfere in states that allowed commercial marijuana sales as long as they were strictly regulated. But pot remains illegal under federal law. The president made news himself last week when he told the New Yorker magazine that he didn't think pot was any more dangerous than alcohol. And he made that comment because marijuana was in the news because of the Super Bowl, because both teams playing in the Super Bowl, the Seattle Seahawks and the Denver Broncos, come from states, Washington and Colorado, where pot is now legal. And some are quipping this week, coincidence? Congressman Blumenauer and Representative Jared Paulus have co-authored a report, The Path Forward, Rethinking Federal Marijuana Policy. Today, the Congressman will lay out his vision of why and how he thinks the federal government needs to change federal drug laws and allow states to continue the evolution and refinement of marijuana policies. After his presentation, I will have a chance to ask a few questions because he knows I like to do that. I quiz him a lot on Straight Talk. And then some members of the City Club will also have a chance to ask some questions. Please welcome Oregon's 3rd District Congressman, Earl Blumenauer.
Thank you, Laurel. Appreciate your kind introduction and being with us here today. You know, I've been asked exactly why, with all the things in the world to deal with, I'm spending time working on marijuana issues in Congress, much less give a City Club speech on it. But I think we should make no mistake. This is a very critical issue for Oregon and for every one of us in this room. And it is not just about legal access to marijuana. This touches on economics, education, the criminal justice system, healthcare, respect for law and public safety, protecting our children, protecting our public lands, defeating drug cartels, and racial equity. And it's also about whether we can ever have a grown-up conversation about public policy in this country. And as the veteran of the death panel controversy, it's kind of a touchy issue with me, but one that I feel strongly about as well. I have been involved with this issue since 1973, when I had a chance to listen as a child legislator barely out of college to what may have been the most powerful presentation I've ever heard a politician make. Republican State Representative Stafford Hansel, a self-described conservative pig farmer from Hermiston, Oregon, who didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't use strong language, carried the bill on the floor of the House to legalize 2 marijuana plants for personal consumption. Now, I'll tell you, Stafford pointed out on the floor that cigarettes, and he held, I'm sure it was one of the few times in his life he's ever held a cigarette, cigarettes, perfectly legal, highly addictive, killed hundreds of thousands of people a year. Stafford, who didn't drink, pointed out that alcohol, for some people, can cause serious problems and led to the slaughter of tens of thousands of people every year by drunk drivers, chronic late-stage alcoholism, liver disease, all from items perfectly legal and widely accepted. And then, and I don't know exactly how he got it, and imagine, those of you in the radio audience, that there's something in this baggie. He held out a marijuana cigarette, pointing out that while addictive and not anything you would recommend for your health, nobody had ever, to this point, been known to die of an overdose, and it doesn't lead to some of the serious problems like we see in terms of alcohol and fueled road rage. You know, it was a very powerful presentation from an outstanding legislator, just giving the facts. Now, I've been told by those who know that if those of us who voted for it had been joined by those who smoked dope but voted no, Oregon would have been the first state to legalize recreational marijuana. But as it was, Oregon in that legislative session was the first state to decriminalize marijuana, and now 14 other states have followed our lead. My early experience in the Oregon legislature, dealing with the issue, the work that led up to the recommendations that we change a policy that was not working and self-destructive, led me to be involved in this since I've been in Congress. And I have consistently supported opportunities to modify, adjust, refine federal marijuana policies. And when my friends Ron Paul and Barney Frank stepped aside 2 years ago, deciding they were going to retire, I volunteered to Barney to sort of step up and help spearhead some effort to try and do this in a cohesive and thoughtful fashion. We have now a bipartisan agenda of 11 pieces of legislation to rationalize the federal treatment of marijuana. There's a matrix available on my website that lists the 11 bills, and on that same website there is a copy of the report that we wrote in terms of the path forward. I invite you to examine it. The bills on that matrix range from legislation that I've introduced that would tax and regulate marijuana with my colleague Jared Polis from Boulder, Colorado, where they've got some firsthand experience with it these days, to legislation that would permit the cultivation of industrial hemp with 50 bipartisan co-sponsors and championed in the Senate by people like Mitch McConnell. Is it going mainstream? Well, I'd like to take a couple of moments to deal with these issues and start with the current failed federal prohibition and how we transition to a system that makes us safer, healthier, and more economically secure. Marijuana in the United States was legal until 1931, or at least not illegal. And then the federal prohibition evolved, ironically, about the time we were figuring out that prohibition of alcohol, A, didn't work, and B, was a really bad idea. It evolved. Today, the key law is the Controlled Substance Act, passed in 1970. Drugs under this act are classified on 5 different schedules based on their supposed potential for abuse and accepted medical use. Marijuana is a Schedule I drug, listed on the same category as heroin and LSD, the most restrictive category. According to federal legislation and regulation, it is more dangerous than methamphetamines and cocaine. And they're Schedule II. Despite thousands of years of history to the contrary, federal law declaims that it has no medicinal use, even though 1 million Americans now are authorized to use marijuana for medical purposes. We've been working to delist or reschedule marijuana from that Schedule I prohibited substance. It's something that the Attorney General could initiate tomorrow and be able to do without legislation. The President of the State of the Union talked about all the things that he could do without messing around with Congress. I think this might be a good place to start. A significant development occurred in 1996 when the state of California was the first to authorize medical marijuana with a vote of the people. Oregon soon followed, and now 20 other states and the District of Columbia, most with voter approval, have established some form of medical marijuana. Remember, according to federal law, it has no medicinal value. This fall, Florida voters, after having generated almost 700,000 valid signatures, will become the first federal state to vote on approving medical marijuana. And the polls are telling us from 65 to 80% of Floridians support this. including 2 polls where more than half the Republicans support it. Looks like Florida may be in line to join the parade. Although, when you're talking about elections in Florida, we're never really quite sure. I have legislation that would protect and rationalize the treatment of these over 1 million people who legally have access to medical marijuana for a situation that varies widely around the country. The active ingredient in marijuana that provides that high is THC. And make no mistake, except for certain medical conditions like extensive nausea for chemotherapy, or some of the things that deal with PTSD, or some of the neuromuscular problems, I would discourage any member of my family from using it. There are real concerns, especially about the harm to the developing brain. We talk a lot about the impact that it may have on adolescence. I am as much concerned about, frankly, I'm even more concerned about what happens in the neonatal state, before the baby is born. What if this mother is using marijuana to deal with acute morning sickness? I'm working with my colleagues and with the administration to remove restrictions on marijuana research so that we can find out answers and be able to deal going forward. But right now, because of undue regulations and the fact that our policy's frozen in time and frankly counterproductive, we can't do that. We don't have the information we need, and that, I think, is a crime. With over 50 million Americans using marijuana every year, regardless of whether or not you think it's the right thing to do to legalize it, at a minimum, we should be able to understand its dynamics, be able to understand the products, their applications. There's also a critical role for public education. That mother I mentioned, who might be using marijuana, I mean, on your bottle of Jack Daniels, there are warnings about health risks, for instance, for pregnant women. We don't have anything like that dealing with marijuana. We need to be able to not only find out the facts, but be able to help the public evaluate the information. It's a critical criminal justice issue. We arrest over 2/3 of a million people a year for something Laural pointed out. The surveys show that now 58% or more of the public thinks should be legal. And if you ask the question, should the federal government interfere with what voters in Washington or Colorado or California, Oregon decide, that percentage goes up even higher. The costs are horrific. We spend billions of dollars a year on failed enforcement and incarceration. It doesn't just cost taxpayers. We are funneling billions of dollars to shadowy, illegal underworld forces, including enriching Mexican drug cartels. Now, we've been working with the administration for several years to try and operationalize President Obama's statement that he had bigger fish to fry than interfering with decisions that states make on marijuana. Unfortunately, in the offices of 93 U.S. district attorneys and the Drug Enforcement Agency, there are still a lot of people who are interested in frying those fish. We need to change law enforcement and corrections practice to avoid locking up nonviolent offenders and instead concentrate on cartels, on drug kingpins, on the people who are involved with much more dangerous and far-reaching illegal practices. And we do need to deal with the challenges of addiction, whether that addiction is alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana, meth. These are serious gambling. These are serious social questions. And I sincerely hope that as we move forward to legalize marijuana and tax it while we regulate it, that we're able to use some of those resources to deal with the plague of addiction. As I mentioned, we have 21 states in the District of Columbia that have legalized medical marijuana, with more to come, and 2 states that have legalized adult use. Yet the federal government, because of the classification of a Category 1 drug, does not permit banks and other financial institutions to deal with those involved with a Schedule I drug. They can't have a bank account from a federally supervised institution. Think about it. If you care about if you care about money laundering, tax evasion, burglary, forcing these perfectly legal businesses to be all cash is insane. Hopefully, the specter of business people in Colorado showing up to pay their state taxes with shopping bags full of cash will illustrate the point. I've got legislation that would correct this situation. And it sounds like the administration is willing to move there as well. There's another practical aspect here that is similarly ludicrous. We're currently using tax provisions that prevented drug traffickers from expensing their yachts and their AK-47s on their taxes as business expenses. Something we would all, I think is reasonable. But that same provision now prevents these hundreds of legal businesses from deducting their business expenses for their perfectly legal activities, resulting in a tax burden that is 2 or 3 times higher than a similar business. It's unfair and it's unwise. I never thought I'd be at a press conference with Grover Norquist, the anti-tax crusader and Republican operative, when he supported my legislation to fix this problem. Finally, there is the issue of hemp that I mentioned. I was pleased that in a pretty grotesque farm bill, maybe a D+, that passed this last year, although last week, there were a few good things for Oregon. In it was the opportunity for agricultural research institutions to research industrial hemp. This passed, actually, an amendment we had that passed on the floor of the House. First time anything like that has happened. Now, when you think about it, it should be not that momentous. Hemp products, after all, are perfectly legal in the United States. You can buy them at Saturday markets, all manner of shops. It's just that Oregon farmers and Kentucky tobacco farmers can't grow the hemp. It's got to be imported from other countries. I mean, it's goofy. You can't smoke enough hemp to get a high. In fact, during World War II, I've got a great picture of a hemp plant about 9 feet high that was grown on the site of the Pentagon, because during World War II, we were encouraging more hemp cultivation because the hemp fiber is very resistant to salt water, and it was part of the war effort. Well, hopefully, we're going to be moving beyond that as well, and there are 22 states that have taken action so that we can move forward with hemp cultivation, and we're getting great cooperation from the Oregon Department of Agriculture, and the Oregon legislature passed legislation that makes this possible. Well, I think Oregon is going to be critical this year to bring these pieces together. Our vote will come forward in the midst of this national drama, playing out with all the arguments, pro and con, the money, the mechanics, the protections, to shift priority and demonstrate impact. Yes, we will all be money ahead when we tax and regulate marijuana. About $100 billion over the next 10 years. And even in Washington, D.C., that's still real money. But the real impact will not be just to generate new revenue on the federal level and, frankly, in the state of Oregon. It is to be able to have new priorities and savings generated by not doing aggressive things that don't work and result in patent unfairness. An African-American young man is almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white young men, same age, even though whites, on average, smoke marijuana a little more than blacks. It's outrageous, and it needs to change. This is the year. We've had some progress in Congress, and the administration's doing some things. We may have marijuana for adult use legalized in Alaska in August. And Oregon is going to be front and center in this debate this fall. If we do it right, we have an opportunity, I think, to change the trajectory nationally, to accelerate it. Oregon and the public has been ahead of the politicians on this issue for years. And all of us, I think, have a role to get it right in Oregon, to face the tough questions, to have the appropriate protections, and most of all, to have an honest adult conversation about an issue that is long overdue for that treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. Are you ready for some straight talk? The Congressman has agreed to let me ask some questions. We haven't rehearsed this. He doesn't know the questions that I'm going to ask. So fire away, right? I think we can infer.
I get to ask you questions? Oh.
Not this question either. I think that we can infer from your comments the answer to this, but just for the record, are you a marijuana user?
I am one of the few in my generation who's never used it and has no intention of using it. Although I will tell you that if I had one of the medical conditions of the people that I have met with in Oregon, for whom medical marijuana has transformed their lives, I wouldn't hesitate to use it for that condition or to recommend a member of my family to do so. But I think being somebody who hasn't, and doesn't intend to, gives me a little more credibility, perhaps, in advancing the issue.
Well, you have a lot of passion for the issue, and I want to go back to a little bit about the scheduling. You talked about Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs. If the president, say, were to take an executive action to move marijuana from Schedule 1, where it is right now with heroin, to Schedule 2, how much of a difference would that make?
Well, we have an opportunity. It makes a big difference in terms of trying to inject some rationality into it. But I would hope that they would delist or move it down further. But being able to take care of some of these anomalies, like the tax law, the banking law, and the situation where we have something that is indefensible. And I've had U.S. attorneys, or deputy U.S. attorneys, I should say, who've said this puts them in a really tough spot when they're dealing, for example, with jurors. Grand jurors trying to explain the marijuana laws because it is so nonsensical on its face that methamphetamines, which created a crisis in this state, and now you can't even buy Sudafed over the counter. I have a story about that. It took me 3 days to get a package of Sudafed. But frankly, I think I could go to any junior high student that I run on the street and find out how they could get a joint in about 14 seconds. But by having the rescheduling and doing it in a more rational fashion, it makes it easier for real law enforcement and for our being able to properly appraise the threats that we face.
You talk about this metrics of 11 bills that you have. Is your ultimate goal legalization of marijuana federally?
My ultimate goal is for the federal government to treat it exactly like we treat alcohol. States are free to regulate alcohol, to prohibit alcohol if they want. I think we just had the last dry county disappear 80 years after the end of Prohibition. I'm perfectly comfortable with Oregonians and people in Utah and Florida and Montana making their own decisions, having a state regulatory system. I don't think the federal government should interfere with the state in this regard, and I certainly don't think they should complicate the situation with a statutory and regulatory framework that makes no sense.
What does this do to international drug treaties? We have reciprocal drug treaties, say with Turkey, Afghanistan, China, India, Mexico. They see us take marijuana off Schedule I, perhaps legalize it. Do they say, well, then we're going to flood the market with precursor to pseudoephedrine, precursor to methamphetamine, opium, a precursor to heroin? Are you concerned about that?
Well, there are a couple of treaty provisions that were part of a different era, that same era of 1970s when we misscheduled marijuana and we were involved in a self-destructive, non-productive prohibition. But first of all, there's no enforcement provision in that treaty at all, none. There's no penalty for violating it. And frankly, I think if you talk, as I have, with some people from Mexico, for instance, they would like us to be more realistic about our drug laws. For us to be able to go after kingpins and serious drug problems here, rather than spending billions of law enforcement dollars and countless hours on things that don't make any sense. If we had a more rational drug policy in this country, we may be able to reduce some of the pressure, for example, on Mexico, which at points looks like it was bordering on a failed state, in part because of huge amounts of drug money from the United States flowing into Mexico, flowing into Colombia. I think if we stopped giving cartels billions of American dollars for marijuana, it would make the real drug enforcement challenge easier.
Let's talk about Oregon. It sounds like you think Oregonians should vote to legalize the recreational use of marijuana in November. Do you think Oregonians should say yes?
There's currently circulating a proposal that I think is very thoughtful. It is along the lines of what was passed with strong support from the voters in Washington and Colorado. I personally think if the ballot measure that had been on the ballot in Oregon in 1972 was like the vote in Washington or the provision in Colorado, it would pass. And I think it's time, I think a good proposal, and I plan on voting for it.
What does that look like in Oregon, in your opinion, if it's legalized for recreational use here? I've heard people ask, when we drive down I-5, are we going to see, instead of grass seed fields, see pot fields?
No. I will tell you, one of the benefits, however, of a rational marijuana policy is likely to be that we can control and manage it, rather than having drug thugs, Mexican cartel people, out destroying our national forests. You know, bring it in, have real rules of the road, have people being able to undercut these thugs and crooks. I think you will see the evolution of a marijuana industry that's legal, that's controlled, you know what you get, and does not do the damage that we have now to our public lands. And I don't think the attention has been paid to what's happened in southern Oregon and in northern California because this is a Wild West in terms of the illegal drug trade.
Congressman, the LA Times recently wrote an editorial that said, why rush? Talking to Californians, but what about here? Why not watch what happens in Washington and Colorado? Why rush into legalizing marijuana in this state?
Well, having worked on this for 41 years, I don't feel invoking the memory of the late, great Stafford Hansel, we've rushed into it. I think, if anything, we've been very deliberate. The evidence of the failed policy is clearer and clearer. We're seeing that there are opportunities moving forward. We're going to have an opportunity to watch what happens in Colorado and what's coming online a little later in the state of Washington. And even if we approve it after what I hope will be a vigorous, spirited, broad-based debate over the course of the next 9 months, then we'll have another year based on that experience and what we want to do before we're implementing it. So I think there's every opportunity to do it in a thoughtful, reasonable way. I think Oregonians are ready, and I think that will be proven if we get a good measure on the ballot in the fall.
Congressman, to let you know, we only have about 9 minutes, you and I, left, so I'm going to try to get through a lot of the questions I have here for you.
Okay, I'll try and answer quicker.
We love your answers. Well, I want to ask you about what's happening in Washington with profiteers. Already, a former Microsoft executive, Jamin Shively, announced his intention to raise $100 million to invest in the pot business. He said, yes, we are big marijuana. Another investor who worked on marketing for Starbucks said, when we started working with Starbucks, nobody was drinking upscale coffee. It was pretty much Folgers in a can. The cannabis industry represents a similar opportunity. Do you have concerns about legalizing marijuana becoming big business?
Well, I'd much rather have it be big, legal, transparent business that is regulated and is taxed and is out in the open, and that somebody who sells it has a license that they can lose and that we can go after. I'd rather have entrepreneurs deal with product development and, as I mentioned, do the research so we know exactly what people are buying, rather than have anybody who thinks that marijuana in this country is not big business now is crazy. It's multi-billion dollars. But the business is done by drug cartels, some of the shadiest people imaginable, who have no scruples, who are involved with a lot of other dangerous, illegal activity, and the profits go God knows where. So it's already big business. That train has left the station. The question is, will it be a legitimate, regulated, taxed big business? And let me tell you, from what I understand, there'll be lots of opportunities for small entrepreneurs, specialty growers, and all sorts of folks that are out there right now in the medical marijuana space. So I think there'll be lots of opportunities wherever you fall on the entrepreneurial scale. I just want it to be open and legal.
What about the issue of addiction? Mark Kleinman is one of the most prominent and outspoken analysts of drug policy. He was hired by the state of Washington as a consultant, and he was interviewed for the New Yorker magazine in an article called Buzzkill that was out in November. And he ultimately said that he's for legalization. He hopes it works out in Washington, but he thinks it will end in tears, and he outlines a number of reasons. One of the things he talks about is addiction, and he says when you legalize any vice, and you held up alcohol there, cigarettes, you talked about gambling, that is where the money is. You want to promote consumption. Could a marketing campaign like the one that turned millions of Americans into Starbucks addicts, and I have to admit I'm one of those, would it do the same thing to marijuana? How do you walk the line between decriminalizing, talking about some of these issues that you're concerned about, and encouraging consumption of pot?
I'm deeply troubled about addictive behavior. I'm troubled that the state of Oregon, with its lottery policy, is encouraging addictive behavior and destroying lives. I am troubled that we don't have stronger regulations on cigarettes, and it's still killing people. And now we're experimenting with new products, electronic cigarettes, that may go down this path. I like Oregon Pinot as much as the next person, but I am deeply troubled that I still see problems with alcoholism in this country, and there are some people for whom alcohol is a serious, serious problem. I would not recommend anybody smoke pot. I told you, with the exception of the medical aspects, I'm not in favor of more addictive activities. But the point, I guess, Laurel, is 50 million people are smoking it now. And they don't really know what they're smoking, and they're getting it from illegal sources. I think we're better able to deal with issues of addiction if we bring it out in the open, if we can regulate it, if we can tax it, and before all the revenues that we will generate from legal marijuana sales disappear for other worthy causes like education and infrastructure. I'd like a significant chunk dedicated to dealing with addiction problems.
I want to ask, why add to it? You've told me you don't want your own grandchildren to smoke pot. If we legalize marijuana, what message, explicit message, does that send to our youth? There was a survey done of 41,000 high school students recently, and 15% of them, the high school seniors, admitted to using pot on a daily or nearly daily basis. General McCaffrey, who worked in the Clinton White House on drug policy, said, there is no question. If you legalize marijuana, you are going to see the consumption of pot by our youth go up. Do you want to see that?
Well, I mean, I was down at the University of Oregon last year, meeting with the student government. It was fascinating, talking to them about what their challenges were. And they told me in great detail how proud they were of their good neighbor policy dealing with fraternity houses and alcohol. And they're working to stop kids from throwing up on neighbors' yards, binge drinking, alcohol-fueled fights. And it was fascinating what they've done. And I said, what about the problem of marijuana on campus? And they looked at me. Yeah, I mean, people smoke, but that's not the problem that we're facing. When you have 50 million people who smoke marijuana, and millions every month, I think the notion that somehow we're going to be able to avoid it with the costs that we have for prohibition, the billions of dollars, the wrecked lives, the racial imbalance, I'm sorry. I think we can deal with this in a way that is forthright, because every parent has to have this conversation with their kids now about marijuana, just like they have it about alcohol, just like they have it about tobacco. And any of you who think that your teenage daughter can't buy a joint faster than a six-pack of beer, I think you need a reality check.
Let's talk a little bit more about the effect on youth. We're doing a story at Channel 8 on marijuana, and one of our reporters, Pat Doris, interviewed an OHSU brain researcher, and she has seen in the brain scans of young people that heavy pot use is causing the frontal lobe and the posterior lobe to show changes that affect, and those areas of the brain affect focus, problem solving, decision making, and she's concerned that bad chemicals from pot are going into young brains. Absolutely. The National Institutes of Health did a study over 38 years that showed when teenagers begin smoking pot into their adult years, they see an IQ drop of 8 points. You talked about college students. Some of the college students we talked to on campus say that their friends who smoke pot are lazier. That's just anecdotal. Yeah. So do we want to raise a nation, I'm asking as critics, of potheads?
No. I mean, what I said in my presentation is that I am deeply concerned about the impact this has on the development, not just of adolescents, but right down to prenatal. We're on the same page there. But you can talk to the same at OHSU and talk about what happens to brains that are fried with alcohol. Let's talk about lungs with people who smoke. I think we need to have a full court press to make sure that we keep it out of the hands of kids, that we do public education. We can't do enough to try and stop that.
That sounds like more law enforcement, though.
But appropriate law enforcement. Because I think what I just said a moment ago, and I've had this conversation with a lot of parents of teenagers, and I look them in the eye and ask, can your kid get a joint in 15 minutes? And they all say yes. They either know somebody who's a dealer or somebody who can get it. And have your head in the sand thinking that we have this failed prohibition and we're stopping it, I think is misguided. I think if we make it harder to get marijuana by having legal marijuana establishments, regulated, taxed, businesses that have something to lose. No drug dealer in Portland checks ID. They don't have a license to lose. And if we change the paradigm and have people with something to lose, and if we focus our attention on law enforcement that makes sense, going after underage users, public education on underage users, but having a stupid law that tells kids that this marijuana cigarette is more dangerous than meth undercuts your credibility. And I don't think that's the way to go.
Congressman, I have a whole bunch more questions for you, so you're going to have to come on Straight Talk soon so I can ask the rest of my questions, because we've run out of time for our portion of Straight Talk, but our audience members are going to continue with their questions. We're now going to open it up to the Q&A portion of the program. If you have a written question on an index card, please hold it up high so that the City Club staff can collect it from you. And we're now going to take questions from the audience. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less, please. Get right to the question, and I'll try to read at least one index card question. So our first question.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for being here, Representative Blumenauer. My name is Roy Kaufman. I'm a City Club member, a resident of Washington County, Oregon. A quick question for you. Recent NBC Wall Street Journal poll that came out this week showing 55% of Americans support legalization, 66% of Democrats, but only 38% of Republicans, yet this is an issue that's ripe for the Republicans to take. It's got homeland security, it's got civil liberties, it's got individual responsibility, it's got states' rights. How do we make sure, as a registered Democrat, how do we make sure that, that this becomes an issue that Democrats embrace and the Democratic Party embraces, just like the Democratic Party has embraced marriage equality as a priority for their agenda? Thank you.
Well, I mentioned we work very hard for this not to be a partisan issue. All our legislation, the major legislation I have, we reach out across the aisle. I think America is going to be better off if we deal with this not as a partisan issue or a wedge issue, but as something that potentially could bring people together, that could take states' rights, libertarians, as well as people who have strong feelings about recreation, come together to do something that stops government waste and promotes individual freedom. And I think if the Republican Party takes this on as a cause célèbre, I think that will be wrong. I hope that they wouldn't. I would like this to be something that isn't decided on partisan merits, but is decided on the facts.
Next question, please.
Paul Milius, club member. Congressman Blumenauer, I had heard your two-plant story at an earlier venue. I think it may have been here some years ago. And as I thought about what question I might ask, I was reminded of that. Do you find the same level of hypocrisy among the members of the august body in which you now serve?
The hypocrisy quotient in Congress is up there. I mean, it's interesting. I had a neighbor in Congress whose office is around the corner of mine just resigned because he bought cocaine in our nation's capital. Cocaine, by the way, under the federal law is supposed to be less dangerous. This is the same guy who had just voted to drug test food stamp recipients. There's a lot of hypocrisy on this, but I think at some point there are people who would just rather not touch it politically, and the public is forcing their hand and I think that's good.
Next question.
Earl, my name is Jim Wittenberg. I'm a city club member also. I've come down to the legislature the term after you did in 1975 as a lobbyist for the Oregon Student Association. And their biggest effort down there with Robert Liberty was to legalize alcohol for students that are 19 years of age. And we couldn't get that passed through the Senate. We got it passed through the House, but we lost in the Senate the weekend after Steve Prefontaine killed himself. But what I'm worried about as a pharmacist in the state for 37 years, I'm concerned about legal prescription drugs. I'm frightened to death what we're doing to ourselves with Ritalin, with psychotropic drugs, with Vicodin, with oxycodone, with Percocet. And what are you guys doing about something that's really killing people in this country? And why are we worrying about this? This is stupid. This is a stupid thing to be involved with.
Jim, you raised a very important point. I mean, there are more drug deaths from prescription drug overdose and abuse, and it's rampant. And this is one of those subjects that I think we need to pay more attention to. And again, rather than a failed system of prohibition arresting 8 million people between 2001 and 2010, let's go after areas where people are dying. People are dying. And this is one that I think is a perfect example. Great point.
I have a question from the audience for you. Can you talk about the implication on drug-free workplace policies, particularly when states legalize it, but the federal government does not change?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to spending some time with people who are human resource experts. We've got problems now in the workplace. The reference that was just made to prescription drug abuse that is addling minds. We have people who drink on the job. We have people who take other drugs. And there are 50 million people who are smoking marijuana now every year. So we need to work to make sure that the workplace is an area where we're helping people who need help. We design the appropriate tests that if people want to do that, have checks and balances. But it goes far beyond marijuana, and marijuana is already there.
Next question.
My name is Mike Litt. I'm a City Club member. In the September 18th issue of the New York Times, there was an op-ed by Sam Polk, a former hedge fund trader. I'd like to read the very short first paragraph. In my last year on Wall Street, my bonus was $3.6 million, and I was angry because it wasn't big enough. I was 30 years old, had no children to raise, no debts to pay, no philanthropic goal in mind. I wanted more money for exactly the same reason an alcoholic needs another drink. I was addicted. And he points out that this addiction to wealth is very common in Wall Street. And it has had, as you, I'm sure, realize, very detrimental effects upon our whole society. If you just look at the income inequality issue, how can we treat this addiction, which has been so detrimental to our society?
Well, in terms of the addiction to money, I would rather start, for example, with the state of Oregon and its addiction to lottery money and what it does to families in Oregon, being out and promoting it. That might be a good start.
We have just a few minutes left. I have a question from the audience that's about driving while high, if that is a DUI offense. It also brings up the impairment issue that I was going to ask you about too, is that THC affects individuals differently, so hard to determine exactly how impaired a driver is. Can you address that issue?
It is a problem. It is a problem now. It will continue to be a problem. We need to work to make sure it's illegal to drive while you're impaired. And hopefully one of the areas of research is being able to do a better job of being able to evaluate that and give law enforcement appropriate tools. I don't want anybody impaired on the road, whether it's prescription painkillers, alcohol, marijuana, meth, and the more we can do to be able to refine that, the better. But it is a problem now, and it will continue to be illegal after this measure passes, if it does.
Another City Club question, please.
Kurt Wavering, member. What can we learn from the Netherlands experience where it's legal?
Well, it is legal, but not really. I mean, they have great tolerance in terms of the use and sort of a live and let live. I think the experience that we're going to benefit from most will be what's happening in Colorado and in our neighboring state of Washington. And we'll have a couple years to be able to look at that. I anticipate that we're in for a good decade of research, refinement, working to make sure that we're able to readjust our law enforcement priorities. This is an important chapter in this story, but even if it passes this fall in Oregon, it's not over. We have a lot of hard work to do to make sure that it's done right, transparently, regulated, and that we get the public education and involvement that's necessary.
We have time for, I think, 2 more questions.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. Hi, Earl. You've made such convincing arguments. I wonder, how did marijuana get to be a Schedule I drug? What were the arguments in favor?
That was part of a historical demonization of marijuana. I think part of it was racial at some level. Part of it is that we were just sloppy when this stuff was slammed together. Otherwise, nobody in their right mind would have suggested that marijuana was more dangerous than methamphetamines, which has been devastating in rural and small-town Oregon and across the country. I think it was just part of a misguided, failed war on drugs, and that reefer madness that some of you watched and laughed at actually made an impact on some people.
Next question, please.
Chris Andre, City Club member. Congressman Blumenauer, thank you so much for being here today. There's a question, though, that lingers in my mind. You touched on virtually the entire spectrum of this question. But the chap that asked about addiction to wealth, to excessive money, and your note, we don't know, what you said was that God knows where it goes, the drug money now, the illegal drug money. I think that we already know that answer from the Rampart scandal and the LAPDs in the early 90s. It goes straight back into Wall Street. How do we regulate? I think the first thing to do in order to come up with sane drug policy is to get illegal drug money out of Wall Street. How?
Yes, yeah, don't watch any of the current movies. I think an important start is to be able to have a system where we regulate and enforce a rational drug law. Start with marijuana, redirect our efforts, and I think that will be a step that we can use to evolve more effective means going forward. But no magic in terms of drugs in Wall Street. Maybe we'd be happier if they were smoking dope and not wrecking, with some of the exotic financial instruments that they've come up with.
I think we have time for just 1 more question. Quick question.
Yeah, Bill Berg, City Club member. I just joined. I spent some time in Amsterdam on the way home from Russia, and from talking with the locals there, and I looked into it when I got back. Addictions actually went down after they had the tolerance policy because it lost its luster. I just want to throw that out,
I think that's an interesting observation. Some people make that claim, that when we had, for example, the prohibition of alcohol, that it promoted, it glamorized it, the speakeasies. We had more speakeasies at the height of prohibition than we had saloons before it started. And that's certainly one of the problems we've seen with youthful drinking, is that it's quite, it's quite something that is out there, that it's prohibited. And then when you get into an environment where you can get it and binge drink, we've had some unfortunate behaviors. And some of our European neighbors that have a more tolerant and balanced attitude, for example, in terms of integrating that glass of wine into the dinner, have less of a problem of alcohol abuse and binge drinking. But I don't know. Okay. Get some stuff on the box on the wall.
Unfortunately, we have run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for today. And as we close, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to Laural Porter and Representative Earl Blumenauer. We are adjourned.